Step into the shadows with us. Here at Paranormal M, we bring you stories that'll send shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe and activate notifications to stay in the loop with our latest eerie narratives. Feel free to drop a comment and help the algorithm. We hope you have a hair-raising time listening. Something may have followed my dad, and now it's here to stay. I live in a fairly new home that my family and I moved into nearly a decade ago in a relatively small city of less than 15,000. We're the first residents of the home, and it's built in a cushy neighborhood. The first couple of years went by without an issue. Nothing seemed off about the place. But I could have been naive, since I had only just started middle school in the year that we moved in. But going into high school, I started to notice things. They were small, but I definitely noticed them. Things like hearing somebody walk around upstairs when I was home alone and downstairs. Now when walking upstairs, the floor will pop, as our home was built in a rush, and there are things in the home that weren't properly built. Even 9 years later, the carpeted floor still pops and creaks the same as it did all those years ago. There were also events of closet doors being left open, either my brother or I, as I'm not sure if it happened to my parents. One of us would wake up in the morning, and our closets would be open. I always chalked events like this up to my imagination, so I never attempted to investigate further. That was until my mom told me about the things that my dad saw. My dad's religious, a Mormon, and so he had gone on a mission to Bolivia in the 80s, where he lived for 2 years. The country at the time was extremely poor, and it was hard to receive any sort of proper medical treatment too. My dad ended up catching many diseases he somehow survived though. Malaria, dengue, which is a disease given by mosquitoes, both of which, and some others that I can't quite remember at the moment. My mom explained to me that my dad actually had was pronounced dead at one point, but had then come back. My dad had never actually lied to me or anyone else in my family before. Perhaps when I was a kid and small fibs about Santa being real, or the tooth fairy, sure, but never actually lied to me or anyone else in my family. My dad's respectable, and any time that he would see a friend or coworker in public, they had nothing but good things to say about him. Even now, being as sick as he is, his friends still come and visit him often. So when I heard about my dad's troubles in South America, I had no doubt that he was telling my mom the truth. And she explained to me that since that day he could see things. He would see apparitions at the end of his bed at night, dark figures, following him around work, as if he worked in a coal mine deep underground. These things immensely trouble him, and he doesn't like talking about them. I myself have only seen 2 dodgy figures. Once I was with my brother and my mom in the living room, my door being right next to it, and a wall that blocks the view of the hallway to the other bedrooms, including my parents' room. The 3 of us were on our phones, fairly distant from each other, when out of the corner of my eye I saw a shadow-like figure dart from behind the wall in the hallway into my room. It was so clear that I looked up, and so did my brother and my mom. We then all looked at each other, and my mom asked, "Did you see that too?" I've also had 2 dogs, both at separate times, act unnaturally. The first dog would often lift her head up, watching towards the hallway, even sometimes chasing something unseen. The dog we have now does the same thing, and recently, as of last week, she was sitting on my lap, looking to the mirror in my room at an angle, growling and barking a little. For context, she never barks. Even when we invite people into our home, she doesn't bark at them. She's a friendly dog. She often looks at herself in the mirror, as my mom has a body mirror that sits on the ground. And when she was a puppy, she barked at herself a few times, but since then she hasn't barked at herself, or seeing any of us in the mirror. She kept turning her head to look behind her, to see who had been in the mirror, but couldn't see anything there, so kept returning her focus to the mirror. There will occasionally be nights where I sit with my dad in the living room, just the two of us, and we're having a conversation, when all of a sudden he looks down the hallway, and I ask him, "Do you see something?" He nods, but I continued the conversation we were having, as to ignore whatever's there. As I said, my dad is currently ill, terminally, unfortunately due to the neuropathy. By the way, he also has neuropathy and had pulmonary embolisms at one point, causing it to damage his lungs, as well as a medication that he's been taking for far too long is damaging his body over time. And him now having type 2 diabetes on top of all these things. When he had the pulmonary embolism, he refused to go to the hospital for nearly a week and was sleeping all the time, only waking to use the bathroom or have something small to eat. He finally asked my brother, and I called an ambulance for him while my mom was away. Later I found out that when he woke up, multiple dark figures would stand at his bed. And earlier before the embolism, when we had the virus, I'm sure you guys can connect the dots, I'm unsure if I'm allowed to say the C word, he'd also see many dark figures standing at the end of his bed. He was hit the worst by the virus due to his autoimmune disease, causing permanent damage to his lungs. My mom's gotten members of her church to come and bless my dad and the house, but had been downstairs while doing it. And no, they didn't bring a Bible and a cross to the house. They just folded their arms, dipped their heads, and said a few words to hopefully banish whatever was there. But it kind of never left, whatever they are. And now I'm left wondering what the next steps are. I've convinced my mom to let me buy some sage so I can go through the entire house and sage it. But what if that doesn't work either? I want to make a comfortable life for what years my dad has left, and when the time comes, I don't want him to be in fear if these things hover around him and what to do about them during his near death. Story number 2. Preparing for a haunting. I feel like Angela from The Office when she says, "I don't actually have a headache, I'm just preparing." My boyfriend and I don't have a haunting, yet we're just preparing. Yesterday we discovered a man murdered. Well, let's not be too crazy about this. We discovered a man murdered his girlfriend and then committed suicide in the apartment unit directly below us. I came home to a swarm of police officers, and I definitely knew there was a problem when I saw the coroner's vehicle backed up to the curb, preparing to load up the remains of the people inside the apartment. After speaking with the officers, we learned that the 2 corpses had been laying in the apartment for approximately 24 to 48 hours before they were discovered. We were incredibly disturbed to think that we were going on with our lives, as per usual, gaming, listening to music, watching movies over the weekend, while something so horrific was lurking just below. I realized I had been having trouble sleeping the last 2 nights, and I had a general feeling of unease and eeriness while being alone. And now, I'm pretty sure that I know why. Later, after speaking to a neighbor, she didn't really succeed in helping my already disturbed head when she told me matter-of-factly that when the bodies go undiscovered, their spirits linger and people nearby will experience feelings of unease, such as what I had been experiencing. I also have heard that victims of violent deaths as well as angry spirits will stick around the place in which they died. Well, the man in the situation obviously was an incredibly angry and violent individual, and I feel so sad for the woman that lost her life at the hands of that monster. This is more getting this heaviness off my chest than anything else. Please delete if not allowed, or has anybody reading this ever lived in a place with a history similar to the story I'm sharing? This place has a suffocating heaviness to it now. Story number 3. Mysterious Knock. When I was 24 years old, I went and visited my old college roommate at his mom's house. His mom was an antique dealer and had a lot of really cool antiques throughout her whole house. The house was on a lake, and my buddy and I went swimming with a bunch of friends. We all got out and we were going to shower, and get ready for a festival that we were going to that night. There were 3 of us getting ready, and it was my turn to shower. The other 2 were sitting in the front yard in lawn chairs. I go in the house and head to the basement bathroom to shower. Right next to the bathroom was a room filled with vintage dolls. It was extremely unsettling, but I just looked at them all and then showered. I got out and I was doing my hair in the mirror when I heard 3 distinct knocks on the door. I called out, "Just a minute," and opened the door, and about 5 seconds later, to my surprise, no one was there. And there was no one in the entire house. I walked upstairs and saw my 2 buddies out in the yard. I went out and said, "Whoever knocked on the door can go shower now." They both looked at me and asked what I meant. I told them about someone knocking 3 times on the door when I was in the bathroom and asked if anybody else was home. They said no. I just kind of dropped it. I'm 37 now, and still remember how distinct the loud knocks were, as I was standing only a foot away from the door when they occurred. I don't know if it was a spirit or something attached to one of the antiques or what, but still gives me chills to this day. Story number 4. Range time. A few days ago, I purchased a new firearm and installed some accoutrements. I'm extremely impatient and wanted to try it out, so as soon as time was available, I made my way to the range. Due to work scheduling, I wasn't really able to get to the range until about 9:30 p.m. Range closes at 10. It's an outdoor range that has lights that can be activated to shoot at night. Per range rules and protocol, I signed into the range book and observed no one else was signed in. A cursory observation of the range verified this to be correct. The range is a field with berms, approximately 15 feet high, acting as dividers. So I turned the lights on, set my targets up, and began shooting. Part of mine and most shooters' personal protective equipment includes hearing protection, of which I have electronic hearing protection. For those who don't know, this hearing protection amplifies ambient sounds when there's no gunshot, as the sound of a gunshot erupts the amplification of your hearing and it ceases immediately, consequently protecting your hearing. As I'm about to take another shot, I hear it. I hear loud, fast, heavy steps in grass, weeds being brushed by as if sounds of someone was running behind me. I'm in such a fright, I immediately turn around with my firearm in a high pectoral index. The side of my firearm is pinned to the side of my chest, dominant elbow at a 90-degree angle. Firearm pointed at an approximate 45-degree angle at the ground, preparing myself to be greeted and/or potentially be engaged by something. Indeed, I was greeted by nothing but a dark, seemingly empty field. Quickly, I reached for my pocket flashlight capable of illuminating the field, which confirmed what I saw. When I turned around, nothing, not a car, animal, or person in sight. Think I may have a ghost. So I moved into a brand new house. Land was an old farm, apparently. And since we had moved in, we had odd things happen. First thing I noticed, it's some items being moved. Like put the remote down on the table, come back to it, and it's moved to the middle. On the baby monitor, we see orbs at night that just disappear in front of the camera. I walked past the door and saw something stood in the hallway. So, walked back only to see the dog staring into the hallway as if she's looking at someone. My Alexa speaker responding to someone asking for music that's happened several times. However, today I was on my own in the lounge. The device was in the kitchen. Baby is asleep. Nobody else in the house. The Alexa sparked to life and said playing something stupid by Robbie Williams on Amazon Music. Now I freaked out like, how's this switched on? I've checked with my partner and she's not done it remotely. And if she did, it would have gone straight to play music and not said, now playing, etc. I've checked my Ring camera and nothing's triggered. I've then checked the Alexa voice recorder and you can hear a very faint, almost distant voice saying the song. I don't recognize the voice. The other thing to note is that my phone battery went from 81% a moment before to 21% after this happened. Story number 6. Ask Reddit. Not something I experienced, but the one of many reasons why my parents, a Hindu family, believe in the seers of our religion. We have lots of stories like this, and this one stood out to me in particular. My dad's best friend growing up in India was always a cautious boy. The reason for this is because his parents consulted a seer to know their fate. The boy was told that he was destined to die young, by cause of water, and this fate is bound to his soul. In an attempt to circumvent this, the boy's parents had his name changed and ordered him to stay away from any forms of water. They thought this had ultimately changed his soul. Names are a pretty big deal in Hinduism. My dad and him had big plans then to leave India during college for greener pastures. They left for Germany and later the United States together. However, midway through college, my dad's friend had to return to India for a family thing. My dad proceeded to America alone and had a family. He then had a business trip back to India and thought, maybe I should visit my old friend. He went back and searched for his friend. The town elder said he had died 20 years ago at the age of 22. The cause of death, drowning, trying to save a child caught in a flood. I think the child survived, so his sacrifice wasn't in vain. I can't explain how the seer saw this or even could know. The seer saw that this boy would die both young, dying at 20, was very young, and by water, he drowned, both of which were correct predictions. I want to believe it's merely a coincidence, but there's way more stories like this than my parents have. People say it's just a coincidence, but story after story, I begin to wonder, could the old religions have been onto something? Story number 7. Ask Reddit 2. Many years ago, my now ex-husband and I purchased what used to be an old farmhouse. It was a unique old house that had been added onto many times over the years. We started updating it room by room and had been living there about a year before we began to work on finishing the basement. I had 3 boys from my previous marriage, who were 9, 11, and 14 that lived with us, but visited their dad every weekend, who lives about a mile away. The first project in the basement we planned on doing was to convert one of the good-sized storage rooms into a walk-in closet for seasonal clothing, sports equipment, things like that. The previous owners had left several cheap metal shelving units behind in this room. We'd never really moved them, but they weren't part of the new design. The night before I was set to start on the project, the boys and I rented videos and watched Stir of Echoes with Kevin Bacon. From what I remember, the movie was about a dad character, Kevin Bacon, having dreams or visions about a young girl who had died and was trying to get him to find her and solve her murder. It wasn't too intense, but had a few suspenseful parts with jump scares and special effects. I recall the end being something about him digging in the basement, trying to find the dead girl, breaking through a blocked wall and discovering her behind some thick plastic sheeting or something like that. Predictable, but we all enjoyed it, especially my 11-year-old who loved scary movies. The next morning, the boys all went to their dads. New Hubs goes to work, and I start on the storage room project. The walls in this room are covered in thin paneling. I start moving the metal shelving out so I can begin work, when I see that the paneling on one of the walls behind the shelving unit isn't snug against the walls like the rest. It's kinda gapping a bit at the bottom. I take a closer look and see a very small slide lock, like a miniature deadbolt cut into the paneling, and a distinct cutout like door. What the fuck? We have a secret room? How cool! Can't keep this discovery all to myself. So I run upstairs to call the boys at their dad's. Eric, and the 11-year-old, answers the phone. I tell him what I found in the basement. Both of his brothers are at a friend's house, but he is super excited to check it out with me. Jumps on his bike and zooms home all sweaty from pedaling so fast. This is exactly the kind of thing Eric loves. We go back to the basement, slide the lock, and pry the door open with a screwdriver. The first thing we see is a thick sheet of plastic, just like in the movie we'd watched the night before. Holy shit! We slam it shut and start laughing. He says we gotta be brave, Mom, so I find a razor knife and slice through the plastic. Inside is a small room with sandy dirt floor that's got several old TV sets and buckets of old glass tubes and an old desk with old newspapers in it. No dead body or Kevin Bacon to be found, but we sure had fun going through the desk and laughing about the secret room that was called the Stir of Echoes room from that point on. My father-in-law said that this was an old-fashioned root cellar that was used to store root veggies and potatoes back in the day. What a strange coincidence that we had watched that stupid movie the night before. Story number 8. Did I die? Who is the lady in white? Am I just crazy? So to get a backstory, I'm a 25-year-old female and at the time suffered with severe sleep apnea to the point that I would stop breathing every 30 seconds for over a minute. I had not yet gotten my sleep apnea machine, and I was struggling to sleep. And one night after not sleeping for days, I fell asleep. But this time it was very different. I felt like I just closed my eyes and I was surrounded by darkness. I could see this light coming out of a doorway. I decided to go towards it. When I got there, there was a lady in white, holding me and guiding me through to what I believe might be the other side. All I could see was trees and a real warm light. I know it sounds cliché, but I felt so peaceful, like nothing could hurt me, and I was free from the burdens of life. I felt weightless, like I no longer was in my body. I soon realized I might have died. I thought, who would take care of my babies? So I asked the lady in white if I'm dead, and she replied, no. I asked her if I could go home. She told me that that was okay to go if I wanted to, but it's also okay to stay, and everyone will be okay, so of course I decided to go. I woke up gasping for air, and it took me 20 minutes to be able to breathe normal again. My whole body was shaking, and my heart was pounding. I wasn't sure of what I'd just seen, if maybe it was just a dream, so I kept it to myself for many years, until one day, my friend just had a near-death or my friend's sister, actually, had a near-death experience. They told me about the lady in white that she saw and how she asked her if she was dead, and the old lady told her that she was not and she could go home if she wanted to, but everything would be okay if she chooses to stay. Just hearing her say those words made me cry. I realized maybe I did die, or did she just have the same crazy dream I did? I don't know if I'm putting this out here hoping somebody will have had the same experience, but it's not something I'd like to tell a lot of people. I know I sound crazy, it just felt so real. I'm just curious, has anybody else seen the lady in white? Or am I just crazy? Has anybody seen this? Story number 9. When I was living in an apartment, I was pretty little. My dad was gone for 2 weeks on a business trip. I was home alone with my mom. I was never scared easy, as I've always been in love with investigating the paranormal, yet respecting it at the same time. If I go into a room and I don't feel welcome, I don't stay. It just seems like common sense to me. I kept having nightmares, all from what I could tell are the same night. I'd be sleeping in bed with my mom. I was young, and I woke up. And after that, a big clown would pop in and see me awake, and I'd wake my mom up and it would charge us and just slaughter us. The clown was emotionless with black and small eyes, had no emotion on its face. I don't ever remember seeing a mouth, but I know it had one. It was white and gray and severely overweight, at least 400 to 500 pounds. It was about the size of a door frame, so almost 6'8", and it never made any sound verbally or physically by walking. It cast a feeling of dread, yet at the same time I got the feeling it just didn't want to be seen. I had a feeling it was curious and observant of me and didn't want to be caught or known. So I had this dream and I was terrified to do anything by myself. There was one more night before that my dad was coming home and I was terrified. I'd be sleeping in my own bed again. We went to bed, I fell asleep. I woke up right after the same dream for the 14th night in a row, except this time I had that feeling of dread still. Something in my gut told me it was happening in real life now, so I closed my eyes and I pretended to sleep. I cracked them as far as I could while still looking asleep and positioned myself under my blanket perfectly to keep an eye on the door. I waited so long, but nothing happened. I finally started to breathe normal, and then it did happen. The same exact clown from the same exact dream walked into the doorway, looked at my mom, then looked at me. It sat there silently. I'd assume making sure that we were asleep, then walked out. I never heard 1 ounce of sound from him, but I could hear the AC. I heard the front door open and close. I never went back to bed that night. The next day, my dad asked my mom why the front door was unlocked. She asked me if I unlocked it. I just said yes, because I knew I'd sound crazy. Story number 10. Witnessed grid lighting in the sky, followed by a thunderstorm. It was 2017, and I cannot forget that evening. I was standing on my patio just outside of an apartment building that backs up to a small concrete retention pond. There had just been a thunderstorm, and the sky looked so magnificent that evening. It was just dusk, still a good bit of light, but not quite dark outside. Sometimes after a summer storm, the sky can appear a greenish-blue color. I'm trying to describe the conditions as best I can, but my boyfriend at the time came out into the porch to join me, and were visited by the strange color scheme in the sky. I looked over to the northeast, across the retention pond, and noticed a vast pink and purple hexagonal-shaped grid pattern covering a large portion of the sky. I had to double-take to see what I had just witnessed. I immediately turned to my friend and asked him, "Do you see that?" Their eyes were wider now, and they responded, there's a grid covering the sky. It went on for what seemed about a minute or two. I was so confused about what I was seeing. I asked my friend again, "Are you messing with me?" I could without a doubt see a pinkish blue grid covering the northeast portion of the skyline. It was incredible. My friend saw the exact same thing. We were both 100% sober at the time. I researched this a bit but can't find anything relevant. I have recreated the image from memory using an AI drawing app, Crayon. The outcome was almost identical to what I saw that evening. This truly blew me away. At first I assumed it was some kind of ball lightning or a possible weather phenomenon. I just can't say what exactly I experienced. I think about it often and would greatly appreciate any feedback. Has anyone else experienced this phenomenon? Demonic experience. I had a dream moments ago about a lady being killed by a few students playing with a gun, possibly by accident, but I forgot the details as I woke up. Anyway, I was in a state of semi-consciousness and acutely aware of my surroundings when I felt a spiritual presence, and with my eyes still closed, I saw a being made of TV static coming directly from outside, and it seemed like it was directly coming from me. It passed right through the wall, and in third person, I saw it float around my chest. I feel like it was a sort of demon attack or an attempted possession, as I felt a negative, fuzzy feeling in my chest. I immediately started to pray, but was forgetting what to say, but managed to get coherent in thought again and repel the evil spirit and demon. I'm a non-practicing Christian. I was baptized Catholic when I was a baby, but used to go to a Protestant church with my older sister when I was in my early teens, and eventually just stopped going altogether. When I was little, I was slightly sensitive to spiritual activity and had several encounters with the paranormal. I've had a very few similar experiences to what had just kind of happened, although it's been a long time since the one before this one. Story number 12. Hearing a familiar voice. We've been living in our cute little house for almost 3 years. It's peaceful and cozy, but it's most definitely haunted. It started with noise coming from a spare bedroom that's used as a tattoo studio. Things would fall and we would hear crashing sounds or things sliding across the floor. When you'd go in the room, everything would look normal. We'd hear the occasional footsteps on the stairs. Well, I'm home a lot. My fiancé works different hours and has a social life, and I like to stay in. I began hearing him calling to me when he wasn't home. It started off with me being downstairs, and I would hear him call out to me, "Babe." "Hey." I thought he came in through the side door, and I didn't hear him, so I would answer. After I got no reply, I would go look for him, only to find that he wasn't home. At first, I thought I was just crazy, but I realized my dogs would lift their heads up and look as if they heard it too. It began to worry me, and when I would be asleep and be woken up by my fiancé speaking to me, he wouldn't be there. It began to become an everyday occurrence, and I was starting to just want to question my own sanity. My mother and I went on a trip to Maine, and while on the trip I was sleeping. I was shook and awake by my fiancé asking what time it was. I was half asleep and grabbed my phone, looked at the time and answered him, only to remember that I was on vacation 2 states away from him. After that happened, I decided whatever it was had to go. I'm a bit witchy, you could say. So I began burning sage and asking kindly to be left alone, offering to allow whatever it was to stay if it could please stop bothering me. Eventually, I decided to take another route, and one day I yelled as loud as I could, "Enough is enough, get out of my house." All of a sudden, the house got really quiet. And then it sounded like the house took a huge breath of air and let it out, almost like a sigh of relief. I've never heard it again since that day. Story number 13. Spirits. This happened when I was 7 years old. I used to live in a certain urbanization which had a park where it was common for families to meet there and spend time together. Eventually, my family conformed to this kind of activity, and we'd go to this park every weekend or so. What I'll be talking about is the last time my family went to this park before we moved to a different urbanization. That's a strange word to use, people. To a different urbanization. I'm just going to say city from now on if it repeats this word. Before we moved to a different city. As usual, I was minding my own business. As a kid, I would just simply be playing, go down the slide, climb the monkey bars, etc. Peak childhood stuff. However, once we started packing our stuff so we could leave the park, something caught my attention when I looked up to one of the fences that separated the park from one of the other surrounding houses. I could see through the fence 2 twins, a boy and a girl, with black hair, both of them. I assumed they were twins because they looked the same age and their faces were similar enough for 7-year-old me to assume that they were related. What caught little me's attention, and still does today, is both the expression that the kids had on their faces and their extremely pale skin. Both of them were smiling and their eyes were looking at me. Not at one of the parked monkey bars or the slide. At me. And I know they were looking at me because that was the first time I experienced the most uncomfortable visual contact ever. Meaning eye contact. Both of these kids were looking at me dead in the eyes. What took me out of that uncomfortable exchange of glances was my father hurrying me up so we could leave. I remember that as I got into the car, I looked back at the fence where the kids were, and they were gone. However, what made little me shit himself was realizing that where the twins were standing was a house that had been in construction for years, apparently. Basically abandoned. I lived in this city for 3 years, or urbanization, and remember that I would have gone into this park on a weekly basis, so I would notice if that house had made any advances. I didn't for all those 3 years. I didn't tell any of my family members, not even my sister, who would already share her experience with me when she saw a ghost on the house that we used to live in, same city. Till this day, I can still remember how both twins looked at me with their grins at the same time. At that time, I thought it was simply an exchange of friendly glances, but now as an adult, and with more experience and understanding in verbal expression, I can say that their grins weren't at all friendly. I'm assuming you mean an understanding in non-verbal expression. Story number 14. My paranormal experiences as a 25-year-old Australian Indigenous man. So the first experience happened when I was 7 or 8 years old. We lived in a suburb called Malden in Darwin, the Northern Territory. There were these Aboriginals from a community called Menengrida that lived up the road from us, and they were notorious for having a lot of domestic violence and always having cops and ambulances over to their house. What happens when the families fight is that they start doing black magic on each other and sending evil spirits and curses to each other. One night, the cat and the dogs in the neighborhood were extremely vocal. The dogs couldn't stop barking and the cats were meowing and running from drain to drain trying to find somewhere to hide. This went on for a good 4 hours until about 12 to 1 a.m. Me and my mom were sleeping, and my sister came running in the house, saying, "Get up, there's an alien ship outside." We get up and go outside, and fair enough, there is something that's silver-colored and shaped like a typical saucer that you see in movies, right above the Aboriginal's house. It had lights underneath it projecting onto the ground, going in circles. There was a light blue color, and from the outside going into the center. It was biggest to smallest, and they were actually circular-shaped. The lights just kept twirling around, and I wish I took a video, but back then phones weren't very common. And even if you did have a good phone, the camera quality was terrible back in the early 2000s. It stayed there for a very long time and then left. The next day we heard of kids that had followed it on their BMX bikes from different suburbs away. This wasn't the only time it happened. It happened at least twice, and every single time it would start off with the dogs and the cats in the neighborhood going crazy. I know it wasn't a fake prop, because of the animals and at least 7 to 10 other witnesses that seen it. I seen a video on YouTube of cats sensing earthquakes before they hit because they have supersonic hearing. And I've also heard that before a natural catastrophe, like a flood, animals will seek high ground a day before it happens. They know things that we don't, for sure. The second weird thing that I seen was when we made a trip to Alice Springs. My sister was dating one of the boys that were from that house, and that family. When we were in Alice Springs late at night, we happened to see another weird thing which very closely resembles the old PS2 startup screen with the colored balls twirling around each other. There was 4 lights, colored orange, green, blue, and red, just twirling around each other in a pattern maybe 12 feet in the air. It was so strange for it to be so prominent and just stay there for a long time doing it and allowing us to see it. My sister told me 15 years later that the reason the lights were following us was because her boyfriend had a curse on him. He was an accessory to murder. He had given one of his relatives an axe to go and kill his wife, and the lights had followed us 1,500 kilometers all the way from Darwin. The third time was at my property in Berry Springs, maybe 60 kilometers out of Darwin. A lot of people started telling us that they see lights on our property, and it's a rural property with lots of land because I'm a traditional owner. We thought it was thieves trying to come on our property with flashlights and steal stuff while we were sleeping. I was around 11 to 12 years old when I saw the light for myself. It was late at night again, and I was going down the stairs because the toilet in the house was broken, and I had to use the outside toilet. About 30 meters away underneath a mango tree, I see a faint light like an old torch when it loses its battery and it starts to turn brown. I was about to yell out because I thought I was going to catch a thief basically, but very quickly I realized that it was gliding and sort of bobbing up and down. And maybe it noticed that I saw it, so the light went from a dim brown color to an immaculate gold color. I can't even describe the color, but it was like a small piece of the sun right in front of me at night. It's like when you see lightning strike at night and it lights up the entire area around it. Well, I saw it in a small, compact ball, the size of a basketball. There is no man-made thing in this world that could match the brightness that I saw that night. It was incredibly bright. It opened my brain up to the whole new brightness that I've never seen. It was kind of like a human spirit, because it turned the corner as if it was walking. I didn't go through the wall, but it was nearby and it stayed on this footpath. I would have stayed and stared at it heading into the opposite direction, but as soon as I seen it, it turned the corner. I immediately thought that I could easily just turn back around and come charging straight at me. I got incredibly scared and it ran back up the stairs. Or I ran back up the stairs, I'm sure. And what made it worse, or worser, was I was home alone and I couldn't go outside and pee. There's a common name for these lights called min-min lights. But I'm not sure if that's what I'd seen that night, because I've heard of people seeing the lights that were either green or red, but this one was a strange type of golden that I've never seen on this earth. The fourth time was when my uncle was dating an Aboriginal woman from a community called the Borroloola. She had a niece whom my sister befriended. There are these things called hairy men. They are ugly little creatures that can pop into the spiritual realm, and our realm. Kids are given these creatures as protectors, apparently. They can hop into the owner's body and help them fight. My sister and her friend that lived with us was stupid enough to accept one of these creatures as a friend, and that's when a lot of crazy things started happening in the house. For example, as we were taking showers, we would hear little giggles and knocks on the door. My mom would fall asleep on the lounge and wake up in a whole different spot at the front door. There were lots of other things that happened that I can't remember because this was at least 13 years ago. We were eating dinner one night, and for some reason they loved coming out and tormenting us when it was a stormy night with a heavy rain. Well, I happened to see one of its faces just peeking up from underneath the table looking at her food. I got a very quick glimpse of it. It had pale skin, a scar on its face going from top to bottom, and black hair that was very thin and horse-like. I immediately got up and screamed and threw the ashtray at it, but it disappeared. We left the house that night, and the next day all of our plates had no food on them. We had to go into town and find some Aboriginal men that knew how to get rid of these things through black magic. They came to the house and were doing all kinds of chants and rituals, and we had never heard in the bush or nearby. And one of the guys threw a rock at it, and it made a dull thumping sound as if it hit flesh. And that was the last that we ever had any paranormal experiences from them. When they were in our house before the men came, I experienced my fourth paranormal encounter. We all started sleeping together in the lounge room, because we were too scared to sleep alone for obvious reasons. I was the only one awake, and I couldn't help but feel there was a presence in the house. I stayed up for maybe 4 hours looking around the room because I felt like it could pop up out of nowhere and I would easily see it. Well, it didn't show itself to me that night, but what it did do is start slamming the cupboard doors violently at least 6 times. I literally didn't hear any footsteps, but it was like it was on the other side of the wall, slamming the cupboards really hard like it was angry. And that was kind of the most frightening experience of my life, because I was the only person experiencing it. It's true that your fear feeds evil entities, because I was scared that night and I was really focusing on it, giving it my energy. And it was really hard to go to sleep that night too, knowing that this thing had physical strength. But I did end up going to sleep that night out of pure exhaustion of staying up really late. All in all, these experiences have helped me build my faith in becoming a Christian man, because I know for sure that demons exist. Something strange was going on in my childhood home. Some strange things happened in my childhood home. It wasn't a particularly old house. It was built in the mid-'80s, and as far as I know, no one had died there. And by the time these things started to happen, at least. Nonetheless, it was a very old part of town, in a part where very dark things happened in the times when Spain governed our country. Just 1 block away from my house, there was once a former lake that dried and was filled a long time ago, where the colonial authorities threw the bodies of a group of Senegalese slaves that were executed for trying to return to their homes. I don't know if any of you believe in spiritual senses of the word energies, but I certainly do. And I believe this is a good explanation of the things that happened in my house. Sometime before I was born, my parents were having dinner with my brother and other cousins, who at the time were living in our house because they were in a university in our city and were just temporarily staying here. My dad had made pichanga, and all were having a good time making chatter, when suddenly they all heard the same thing, the strident cry of a baby coming from my brother's bedroom. My mom recalls that it was loud and short, just one single cry that got everybody out of the loop, and as soon as it appeared, the sound was away. The weird thing is, there was no baby in our neighborhood at the time. Our neighborhood consisted of semi-detached houses, so it's not as far of a shot to theorize that it could have been a baby that stayed the night in one of our neighbors' houses, but the walls were very well insulated. Also, everybody remembers that the cry wasn't muffled. It clearly sounded as if it was inside of our house. Old TVs tended to turn off by themselves. Also, things used to get lost pretty often, and then they'd reappear in the most obvious of places, usually in the places that had been searched previously to the point of exhaustion. My brother blamed the gnomes. A more shocking experience happened to me when I was about 7 to 9 years old. My brother threw a party in our house with a couple of friends from university. I was on our old family computer, probably playing RuneScape in the same room where the party was going on, and then I heard a woman screaming. It was a friend of my brother's former girlfriend. For anonymity's sake, let's just call her Carla. She stood below the arch that leads to the living room, just in front of the stairs, staring with horror and yelling at an empty space on the wall. She began to cry and Carla tried to calm her down, but it was in vain. She insisted on leaving. Whatever she saw had disturbed her deeply. My brother says that once she was a bit more calm, she claimed that she saw a man standing on the stairs, staring at her with wrath. It was wearing a long trench coat and a cowboy hat, and everyone seemed to ignore his presence. Everyone but her. The thing that scared the fuck out of her were his eyes. She claimed that she sensed some kind of ineffable anger in his gaze, and that she was too scared to be in that house. Understandably, she never came back to our house. But there is one particular encounter I remember the most, as it is the most unbelievable, unexplainable, illogical, and baffling thing, not just of these stories I've told you, but of my entire life. One night not so distant from the other story, my mom wasn't at home for reasons I don't remember anymore, and my brother had just left for a party at Carla's house. I remember him wearing a black trench coat and a brown leather hat. And so, my dad and I were home alone for the night. We were on the couch watching History Channel as usual. In those years, when it was still half about history and half about aliens, antiquities, and trying to catch Bigfoot, only to find nothing at all. But all of a sudden, we heard the front door slam shut. We naturally turned our heads, and there he was, a man in a leather trench coat and leather hat. His clothing seemed anachronistic, out of time. At the moment, I couldn't get a glance of his eyes as the rim of his cowboy-like hat was tilted down, but I remember he had a 3-day stubble beard and a sharp-faced complexion. He was dressed almost exactly like my brother, and he had the exact same beard style. I remember thinking, oh, my brother's home early. Also, thinking he was my brother, my father tried to talk to him, but he went directly upstairs, ignoring us completely. In that moment, I could get a glance of his eyes. They felt soulless, inhuman. I could not sense any evilness in his eyes, like Carla's friend claimed it did. I remember how he stomped up the steps with haste, almost with anger. I also remember thinking that the man wasn't my brother. His face wasn't similar at all. My dad, skeptic and stubborn as he was still thinking that it was my brother and said to himself, "This fucker came back home drunk again," or something along those lines. After pondering on the strangeness of the situation, my dad asked if I remembered hearing the door being opened, but can't recall if I did. And also, I'd be lying if I said I remember what I answered, because I probably just shrugged. My dad then tried to make me go upstairs to check on my brother's bedroom, but I was scared shitless, and I refused to go there alone. Finally, we both went upstairs, and we entered my brother's bedroom. Behind the threshold, there was nothing but darkness. The lights were off, the windows were closed shut, and there was no sign of anybody being there. My dad checked on the closets, checked the windows, and then checked on the other bedrooms. We were all alone. There was no trail of this... They spelled this wrong. There was no trail of this man. I think they meant anachronistic man. We went back downstairs to continue watching our show, trying to forget what had just happened. But it simply wasn't possible. The absurdity of the situation didn't make that possible. Shortly after, my brother came back home. My dad questioned him about the whole situation, asking him if he had jumped out of the window or something. My brother denied doing such a thing with an expression of bewilderment on his face. That was that. We didn't touch the matter and we moved on with our lives. Some days we would remember while watching a horror movie and say, "Hey, remember that hat man?" And time passed and so on and so forth. At a time I even had forgotten the whole situation for years. And then it simply went back to my head. I remembered the hat man just out of the blue. According to Chilean rural folklore, the hat man is an angel of death. To some others, he is the devil, and his presence is nothing but the promise of loss and misfortune. That makes sense because my dad's life was cut short by an anaphylactic shock when I was 12 years old. My life hasn't been the same since his death, both economically and emotionally. After my dad's passing, we eventually moved away from that house. To this day, I still wonder, will I see the Hat Man again? Story number 16, Yellow on Yellow. Back in 2004, my son and I were just with my aunt, driving back to my parents' house. I felt tired, so I fell asleep in the front passenger seat. I had a dream there was a small yellow pickup truck in front of us, when suddenly the driver slammed on their brakes, making us crash into this truck's rear end. The yellow truck had a yellow smiley emoji face on the back. I woke with a gasp, sitting up in my seat. I was reassured by my aunt that everything was okay, and I said, "As long as we don't crash into a yellow pickup truck with a happy face sticker on the back, we'll be fine." She asked me what I meant by that. I told her about my dream. She looked skeptical. "You'll see. When we get we'll see it." They crossed out letters here. An hour later, a small yellow pickup truck turned onto the highway we were on. And when the truck got in front of us, we saw the happy face sticker on the back of the truck. "There it is," I said to my aunt. I asked her to keep her distance, but at some point we were near the truck again, and sure enough, the driver slammed on their brakes, but we were able to avoid crashing into the back of that truck. My aunt drove around the truck and sped away, leaving the yellow truck behind. Unexpected Visitor. Story number 17. In 2012, my mom was dying from acute lymphoma. She was in the hospital due to elevated platelets and fever. I was at home, walking through the dining room toward the kitchen, when I saw something sitting in my mom's seat at the head of the dining room table. At first, I thought it was my mom, but the person was male with black hair, dark skin. Kinda looked like my uncle, my mom's brother, but I knew my uncle would never visit us. I realized who it was, and just as I did, the person disappeared. Dazed, I continued to the kitchen when I saw someone sitting on the back step in the backyard. It was the same person, and after a few seconds he disappeared before my eyes. This person died in 1989 from the same illness, all the way in Japan. He shared the same skin and hair color as my mom. One would think that seeing him would make me happy, but I wasn't, because I knew why he had come. He came for my mother because she was dying. This unexpected visitor was my grandfather, her father. A week later, as my mom was dying in her bed, He did come for her, as did my dad, whom died 4 years prior. I felt their presence, and when one of my aunts asked my mother if they're here/there, read it as one word, my mother confirmed that she could see them. Story number 18. Hangman in a Hotel. When I was 13, my school orchestra went on a field trip to New York City. It was a fun field trip until we got to the hotel in Manhattan. The room I was assigned had 3 other girls, and it was uncomfortable, but I didn't know why. It was unnaturally cold, but before I could adjust the room temperature, we were told that we were going to dinner in Chinatown. I left the room with my roommates, and I forgot about the room. After dinner, the girls in the orchestra got together in one of the girls' rooms. They talked about girl stuff. They were talking about which boys were cute, and when they asked me which boy I thought was cute, I drew a blank. I got bored and went back to my assigned room, which still felt unnaturally cold and uncomfortable. I told myself that it was just my nerves, because I was with a bunch of schoolmates I hardly knew anything about, and I was in New York City. Soon my roommates returned, saying that they were kicked out and told to go to bed. That night, when my roommates were getting some sleep, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, and around 2 a.m. I turned towards the window. I noticed that the curtains were brighter, and to my shock, there was a shadow of a man hanging from his neck by a rope. I gasped, stifling my scream sitting up. The other girls asked me what was wrong, and I told them what I saw. They opened the curtains, the window, and one of them poked her head out, looking around. She told me that she saw nothing. She closed the window and the curtain, went back to bed. I turned my back away from the window, thinking I was just crazy. The next day we left New York City, after visiting the Statue of Liberty. I was relieved to go home. I didn't talk to anybody on the bus. I tried finding the hotel recently, but it's gone now. I don't know who the man was or why he hung himself. Story number 19. There's footsteps with no body walking around my backyard. I have a few friends over, and we went outside after dark just to smoke some cigarettes on the back porch. We kept hearing footsteps outside, but when I shined my flashlight into the yard, nobody was there. The footsteps came really close to us. All 3 of us heard the same thing. One of my friends went out later by herself. She said she heard it step right in front of her, got close enough that she could hear breathing, but nothing was there. It's not 3:30 a.m. My other friend is outside again, and he's still hearing footsteps too. Is my backyard haunted? What could it be? One of my friends, or just, I guess you could call them a native, and she says it's not a skinwalker. I live in Arizona, where there might be skinwalkers, because nobody here is drawing one of them in. I'm ordering a Ouija board next month, and I'm going to try to communicate with the entity later. Bad idea. I'm really hoping that it's a good or a neutral entity and not something I have to worry about. As a kid, I was really afraid of my backyard at night, so it's possible the entity has always been here. Or it might be my late brother. What are your thoughts? Should I put a line of salt outside my patio door? Other thing I'm thinking is somebody might be living under my patio. That's the end of today's stories. As usual, I hope you guys drop a comment, leave a like, and suggest this to other folks, so that way we can keep spending these evenings together. Alright, see ya.